Over the past few months, I've spent an unimaginable amount of time testing Z890 motherboards, which in hindsight may not have been the best use of my time because I'm not really sure how many of you even want Z890 motherboard testing and buying advice and all that sort of stuff, but I suppose for those of you who do, you're welcome. So on hand for testing, I've managed to acquire 50 Z890 motherboards. Actually, I think I have a few more than that, but some of them are the Wi-Fi and non-Wi-Fi versions of the same board. And if this looks like a lot of motherboards, well, it is, but this isn't even all of them. I couldn't fit all of the boxes on the desk here while also seeing me. So there's a lot of boards. Probably too many Z890 motherboards, but because I'm not a sane person, I just thought, let's test them all, install each and every one of these motherboards into a case, attach thermal probes to the rear side of them, install the necessary hardware, and then run a series of tests, which takes about a day per board to complete. So it's been a lot of fun, I guess you could say. And now it's time to present all the data, which is going to take a lot of time because of the sheer number of products that I will be covering in this single video. I'm just going to go briefly over each model, and then we'll eventually get to all the data that we have, and then make a few picks, select a few standout models. So anyway, let's get into it. Okay, so the most affordable Asus Z890 motherboard is the Prime Z890M-Plus Wi-Fi, and it's coming in at $230 US, so quite a high price tag for what is really a very basic motherboard, though to be fair it has all the essentials. You're getting 10 80-amp power stages for the V-core, large VRM heatsinks, a pre-installed I/O shield, 4 PCIe slots on an M-ATX board, 3 M.2 slots, Wi-Fi 7, 2.5 gigabit LAN, 20 gigabits per second USB, and 8 USB ports on the rear I/O. Now, the most affordable ATX Z890 motherboard from Asus is the Prime Z890-P Wi-Fi, and it's essentially a beefed up version of the Z890M-Plus. And for just $10 more, it includes some nice upgrades. For example, the VRM now features 14 80-amp power stages, there's an extra M.2 slot at 4, the primary M.2 gets a heatsink, the primary PCIe x16 slot gets an easy release mechanism, though there are 2 fewer USB 5 gigabits per second ports on the rear I/O. So the rear I/O is very disappointing given the price. Then for an additional $10, taking us to $250, there's the Z890 AYW Gaming Wi-Fi W. Odd name, and I'm not exactly sure what the deal is there, but I suppose it doesn't really matter. This is a great looking board with a mostly white theme, though be aware the VRM is slightly downgraded from the Z890-P Wi-Fi with 12 80-amp power stages for the V-core, and you're also only getting Wi-Fi 6. On the plus side though, all M.2 slots now feature heatsinks, and the rear I/O has been upgraded with an additional 2 10 gigabits per second USB ports, so a bit of an odd configuration overall, I'd say. Now, the Asus Tough Gaming Z890-Pro Wi-Fi looks very serious, though it also gets a pretty serious price tag at $290 US. It's a silver/white board, and this one jumps up to 16 80-amp power stages for the V-core, and it's littered in heatsinks covering most of the board. There's 5 PCIe slots in total and 4 M.2 slots, along with Wi-Fi 7 and 2.5 gigabit LAN. The I/O panel is more respectable and really what you'd expect to see on a board with a flagship chipset. So there's no USB 2 ports here, just half a dozen USB 10 gigabits per second ports with 2 Thunderbolt 4 USB Type-C ports. And the black version of the Tough Gaming is the Plus model, and it does away with the massive heatsink over the M.2 ports, leaving the second port naked, while ports 3 and 4 get a long heatsink, and the chipset also has its own heatsink. Other than that though, they're the same motherboard and they both cost $290. Now we're stepping up to the most affordable ROG Strix model, the $370 Z890-A Gaming Wi-Fi, so an almost 30% jump up in price. Now for that extra money, you are getting a cooler looking board. Not that the looks are all that important, but it does look cool, so whatever. The VRM has been upgraded with 90 amp power stages, but there's still 16 of them, which is plenty of power delivery. The board also includes 5 M.2 slots, 2 PCIe x16 expansion slots, Wi-Fi 7 and 2.5 gigabit LAN. There's 8 USB 10 gigabits per second ports in total on the rear I/O, 3 of which are Type-C and 2 support Thunderbolt. There's also numerous easy release mechanisms on this motherboard for stuff like M.2 ports, Wi-Fi antenna and PCIe slots. Jumping into the $400 US price range is the ROG Strix Z890F Gaming Wi-Fi at $430 US, and this one upgrades those 16 V-Core power stages to 110 amp models for even greater power delivery, and now we are well into overkill territory. The I/O has also been upgraded with 4 more USB ports, 2 USB 2.0 and 2 USB 5 gigabits per second ports, while an additional 10 gigabits per second USB port has been converted into a Type-C, providing 4 Type-C ports in total. Other than that, the F and A gaming are very similar, so based on that, I'm not sure the F gaming is worth the additional $50. Then for another $40, you'll find the ROG Strix Z890-E Gaming Wi-Fi at $470 US, and this is a beefy motherboard. It packs 18 110 amp power stages, an insane 7 M.2 slots, 3 of which are PCIe 5.0 compliant. There's 2 PCIe slots, and when compared to the F gaming, the I/O has been upgraded with an additional 3 10 gigabits per second ports. So it drops the USB 2.0 ports, though the total number of USB ports does remain the same at 14. Of course, Asus has a productivity-focused board, and the ProArt Z890 Creator Wi-Fi costs $490. The VRM is sufficient with 16 90 amp power stages, and there's plenty of heat sinks here. On board, you'll find 5 M.2 slots, one of which is PCIe 5.0 compliant. There's 3 spaced out PCIe x16 slots, and there's a reasonable amount of connectivity on the rear I/O with 10 USB ports in total. However, the crucial feature here is the 10 gigabit LAN, a must-have feature for most professional users. And the other professional feature are the 2 PCIe 5.0 x16 slots, which can be run in a x8/x8 configuration for dual graphics cards. Now, things get crazy with the ROG Maximus range, and we'll start with the Z890 Hero, which costs a cool $660 US. Maximus might mean greatest or largest, but in the context here it means overkill. Extreme overkill it seems, as there are 22 110 amp power stages just for the V-Core. You're also getting 5 gigabit LAN along with 2.5 gigabit LAN and Wi-Fi 7. When compared to the ROG Strix Z890-E Gaming Wi-Fi, there is 1 less M.2 slot, but all 6 are PCIe 5.0, so twice as many PCIe 5.0 M.2s. The rear I/O USB support has also been downgraded with just 3 USB Type-C ports and just 4 10 gigabits per second Type-A ports, rather than 7 that you get on the Strix model. So based on that, I feel it'll be difficult for most to justify spending $170 more on the Hero when compared to the E-Gaming, as you're really not getting that much for a 35% premium. The ROG Maximus Z890 Apex is an extreme overclocking focused motherboard with just 2 DIMM slots, which allows for the highest possible memory speeds to be achieved. There's 6 M.2 slots in total, 2 of which are found on the ROG DIMM2 card, and then there's the same 22 110 amp power stage V-Core found on the Hero, while there's 5 gigabit LAN and Wi-Fi 7. Overall connectivity on the rear I/O isn't anything special, there's 11 USB ports in total, but again, this is an OC focused product, so that probably doesn't matter. And if you're looking at getting the absolute most you can out of a Core Ultra processor, and money's not an issue, then the $715 Apex is going to work well. Speaking of money, if you've got it to burn, then the ROG Maximus Z890 Xtreme is the $970 motherboard that you're looking for. If 22 110 amp power stages weren't enough, well, I've got good news. The Xtreme packs 24. There's 6 M.2 slots, 3 are PCIe 5.0 compliant, 2 PCIe 5.0 x16 slots, 1 wide for x16 and the other x4 bandwidth, Wi-Fi 7, 2.5 and 10 gigabit LAN, though the I/O configuration isn't anything crazy. 10 USB ports in total, 5 of which are Type-C ports, but 2 of them do support Thunderbolt 5. This means 80 gigabits per second throughput for the Thunderbolt 5 devices and 40 gigabits per second for USB 4 devices. So if you're after Thunderbolt 5 support, the Maximus Z890 Xtreme might make sense at almost $1,000. Then finally, we have the ROG Strix Z890 iGaming, which is a $450 mini ITX motherboard. The V-core features 10 110 amp power stages, and the VRM heatsink does utilize active cooling via a small fan. There's of course just a single PCIe 5.0x16 slot, but Asus has managed to include 2 M.2 slots along with 2 SATA ports. You're also getting Wi-Fi 7 and 2.5 gigabit LAN, along with 9 USB ports on the rear I/O panel. There's 3 more via the front connectors, and then 3 on the ROG FPS card. Oh, an additional 2 on the ROG Strix Hive 2. So overall, an awesome mini ITX motherboard. The only real downsides here are the fact that it supports just 2 M.2 devices, and of course the price, which is very high. The most affordable MSI Z890 motherboard is the Pro Z890-P Wi-Fi, and at $240, it competes directly with the Asus Prime Z890-P Wi-Fi. The VRM is considerably worse though, despite also using 14 power stages, and this is because instead of 80 amp models, MSI has used lower capacity 55 amp rated power stages. So it'll be interesting to see how they compare in our thermal testing. Apart from that though, they are very similar motherboards, as the Pro Z890-P Wi-Fi includes 4 M.2 slots, 4 PCIe slots, Wi-Fi 7, though MSI has upgraded from 2.5 to 5 gigabit LAN. The rear I/O configuration is almost identical. MSI has just included an additional USB Type-C port. So if MSI's VRM is up to the task, the Pro Z890-P Wi-Fi could prove to be the better board, though they are very similar overall. Now, if you're willing to spend a little bit more money with MSI, they have the Z890 Gaming Plus Wi-Fi for $270, and for that extra $30, there aren't that many upgrades if I'm honest. For example, the V-core VRM remains the same with 14 55 amp power stages, the PCIe slot and M.2 configuration remains the same, though there is much more cooling for the M.2s. The board still features 5 gigabit LAN and Wi-Fi 7, though both have been upgraded from Realtek to killer controllers. The USB and rear I/O configuration remains exactly the same, so really you're just getting a more aggressive looking motherboard with a few more heatsinks. So for most, the upgrade probably isn't going to be worth it. Then we have the Z890 Tomahawk Wi-Fi, and can I just say MSI does an excellent job with their motherboard names. They're all quite distinct from one another, though I don't particularly like the MAG, MPG and MEG acronyms, so I guess nothing's perfect. Anyway, the Tomahawk is a great looking board, and this model comes with 16 90 amp power stages for the V-core, so we're back into overkill territory for the VRM, and of course we're also getting massive heatsinks. Other features include Wi-Fi 7, 5 gigabit LAN, 3 PCIe slots, 4 M.2 slots, dual Thunderbolt 40 gigabits per second ports, and 10 USB ports on the rear I/O, all of which are 5 gigabits per second or better. So a well-stocked motherboard that should compete very well at this price point. Now, the Pro Z890-A Wi-Fi isn't a board I expected to find at the same $290 price point as the Tomahawk, but this appears to be how MSI has positioned this model. Specs-wise, it makes sense though. You're getting the same 16 90 amp V-core VRM, there's 3 PCIe x16 slots, 4 M.2 slots, dual Thunderbolt 4 ports, 5 gigabit LAN, Wi-Fi 7 and 10 USB ports on the rear I/O, all of which are 5 gigabits per second or better. Jumping up from $290 all the way to $370, we find the Z890 Edge Ti Wi-Fi, a white-themed motherboard with a massive tool-free heatsink covering multiple M.2 slots as well as the chipset. MSI has again gone with a 16 90 amp power stage V-core, and for good measure, they've slapped a massive heatsink on it. There's 3 PCIe slots, 5 M.2 slots, though just one of them is PCIe 5.0 compliant, and then there's Wi-Fi 7 and 5 gigabit LAN. The rear I/O receives an additional 2 USB ports, though one is USB 2, so for an extra $80 you aren't getting that much, at least in terms of specs, so it'll come down to how much value you place on the upgraded heatsinks and LED lighting. Then we see that pricing goes to the moon with the Z890 Carbon Wi-Fi, $500 for this one, so what are you getting? MSI's gone wild with the VRM, packing out the V-Core portion with 20 110 amp power stages. So again, complete and utter overkill there. There's 3 PCIe x16 slots wide for x16, x8, and x4 bandwidth, which can be configured as x8, x4, x4 when all 3 are in use. There's 5 M.2 slots, just one of which is PCIe 5.0 compliant, but MSI has packed out the rear I/O, which I love to see. There's 13 USB ports in total, all of which are 10 gigabits per second or better. There's 2.5 plus 5 gigabit LAN, so dual LAN ports there, along with BAS flashback, clear CMOS, and smart buttons. Still, despite all of that, this model does cost $210 more than the Tomahawk, and for that you're getting a very similar PCIe configuration, the same audio solution, just an extra M.2 slot, and an additional LAN port. In fact, the biggest upgrade is the USB support on the rear I/O panel, so you really have to be in desperate need of many USB 10 gigabits per second ports for the Carbon Wi-Fi to make sense, but still, it is a great looking motherboard overall. Okay, so now we're at $650 with the Z890 Ace, so another $150 over the already arguably overpriced Carbon Wi-Fi. This model comes with 24 110 amp power stages powering the V-Core, so I guess sure, why not? The Ace supports 3 PCIe x16 slots that can be run in a x8x8 configuration, or the same x8x4x4 configuration as the Carbon when all 3 ports are in use. The audio has been upgraded to the ALC4082 codec with the ESS9219Q combo DAC. There's still 5 M.2 slots, though 2 of them now support the PCIe 5.0 spec. And the big upgrade here is the 10 gigabit LAN support. There's also 15 USB ports on the rear I/O, and all are still 10 gigabits per second or better. So you'd really have to want the 10 gigabit LAN to spend the extra money. Though if you were to add this feature to the Carbon using a PCIe card, you could do so for as little as $60, and you could easily snag a good quality one for $100. And that's an arguably better deal, as you get to keep the 2.5 and 5 gigabit LAN connections already on the Carbon, so I guess keep that in mind. Then we have the Z890 Unify-X, MSI's answer to the ROG Maximus Z890 Apex, and it's ever so slightly cheaper at $700. As an overclocking focus board, there are just 2 DIMM slots, and whereas Asus went with 22 110 amp power stages for the V-Core, MSI has opted for 20, so a very small difference there. MSI has thrown a backplate on the board though, but apart from that the cooling configurations are quite similar. I'd say overall the Unify-X is a bit more well-rounded. The I/O configuration, for example, is much better. You're not only getting more USB ports, but there's also more high-speed ports. MSI has also included legacy PS2 ports for both the keyboard and mouse, whereas Asus only offer a single combo port. The PCIe slot and M.2 slot configurations, though, are very similar, and overall, they're both great-looking motherboards for overclockers. So it'll come down to whichever overclocks the best, and I really don't have an answer for you on that one, or I suppose which one you prefer the look of. The Asus board is white-themed, or MSI has gone with a black theme. Finally, from MSI, we have the Z890 iEdge Ti Wi-Fi, a mini ITX motherboard that costs $370, which is considerably more affordable than the Asus mini ITX offering. Interestingly, you're getting the same V-Core VRM as the Asus board with 10 110 amp power stages. Where MSI has managed to blow Asus out of the water is with the M.2 support, offering twice as many slots with 4 in total, and this is an important feature on a mini ITX board as you can't simply expand M.2 storage using a PCIe slot, as there's just one, and that's typically used to install your graphics card. So for this feature alone, I'd be more likely to purchase the MSI model. MSI also includes a significantly better I/O configuration with no USB 2.0 or even 5 gigabits per second ports in sight. Rather, you get 8 10 gigabits per second ports with 2 Thunderbolt ports. And not only that, but on the $450 ROG Strix Z890-i Gaming, Asus only offers 2.5 gigabit LAN, whereas MSI includes 5 gigabit LAN, which, like the M.2 ports, isn't something you can really upgrade on a mini ITX motherboard. So in my opinion, the Z890 Edge Ti Wi-Fi is a considerably better product at a considerably lower price. Okay, time for the Gigabyte range. We'll start with the most affordable option and the cheapest Z890 motherboard yet, the Z890 UD Wi-Fi 6E, which can be had for $210. As the name suggests, this model drops Wi-Fi 7 for Wi-Fi 6E, though you do get 2.5 gigabit LAN. There's 3 M.2 slots, 4 SATA ports, and 4 PCIe x 16 slots wide for x16 x 4 x 4 x 1 bandwidth. The VRM is also quite basic, though should be adequate, with a dozen 60A power stages on the V-core. Sadly though, this board doesn't include a pre-installed I/O shield, though the I/O configuration itself's decent, with 10 USB ports in total, 4 of which are the old 2.0 spec. For $240, there's the Z890M Aorus Lite Wi-Fi 7, and this is a micro ATX motherboard, and despite the more entry-level price tag, it looks reasonably high-end, especially when compared to the likes of the Asus Prime Z890M Plus Wi-Fi, which comes at a similar price. Now, Gigabyte's gone with a dozen 60A power stages for the V-core portion of the VRM, and there's plenty of heatsinks on this model, not just covering the VRM, but also 3 M.2 slots. The M.2 heatsinks also feature tool-free designs, and the primary PCIe x 16 slot gets an easy release button, neither of which can be found on the Asus model. The I/O shield is pre-installed, and the configuration is fairly standard for this price point, though there are 10 USB ports in total. Also retailing for $240, we find the Gigabyte Z890 Eagle Wi-Fi 7, an ATX model, this time using 14 60A power stages for the V-core. Again, Gigabyte has managed to include heatsinks for all 4 M.2 slots, and tool-free heatsinks at that, whereas MSI and Asus only featured a single heatsink on the primary slot. Then over at the rear I/O, we again find 10 USB ports in total, one of which is a USB 4 port, rather than Thunderbolt 4, which for this particular board I prefer, as Thunderbolt 4 support on the MSI Pro Z890-P Wi-Fi limits USB 4 devices to 20 gigabits per second, and I feel more PC users will adopt USB 4 devices than they will Thunderbolt 4, so I really like what the Eagle is offering here at $240. Then for an additional $20, there's the Z890 Gaming X Wi-Fi for $260, and this model increases the V-core VRM up to 16 60A power stages, and you're also getting a better looking board with a nicer looking heatsink and LED lighting combo, if that's important to you. Other than that though, they're almost the exact same board, both use the same audio and networking with 2.5 gigabit LAN and Wi-Fi 7, 4 M.2 slots, the same PCIe configuration, and the rear I/O is almost identical, though the Gaming X does drop one of the 3.5mm audio jacks for optical out. Adding another $20 to your budget will get you the Z890 Aorus Elite Wi-Fi 7 for $280, and now we're getting 16 80A power stages for the V-core portion of the VRM. Like the $240 micro ATX version, the Aorus Elite Wi-Fi 7 looks like a high-end motherboard, and it really gives MSI's Tomahawk a run for its money. There's 4 M.2 slots in total, all are covered by tool-free heatsinks, and there's also an easy access mechanism for the primary PCIe slot. But the rear I/O configuration isn't nearly as good as the Tomahawk. There's just a single Thunderbolt 4 port and 2 10 gigabits per second ports, 3 5 gigabits per second ports, and 4 USB 2.0 ports, so a big downgrade in that regard, and for me, I feel like the Tomahawk is a more well-rounded product. For an extra $50, there's the Z890 Aorus Elite X Ice at $330, which places it in a bit of a unique price range. Firstly, as an Ice board, this is an all white/silver design, and it really is an all white/silver design, which includes stuff like the onboard connectors, and I have to say, it does look pretty amazing. Gigabyte's again gone with 16 80A power stages for the V-core, and the board is covered in heatsinks. In total, there's 5 M.2 slots, 3 PCIe slots, and around at the rear I/O, you're getting 11 USB ports, though just a single Thunderbolt 4 port and no other Type-C connectors. Again, the configuration here is a bit underwhelming and worse than what MSI offers on their cheaper Tomahawk model. Like Asus, Gigabyte does have a productivity/creativity model, and it's called the Aero G, and it costs $350. So a lot less than the almost $500 Asus ProArt Z890 Creator. This model again uses 16 80-amp power stages for the V-core. There's 5 M.2 slots and 3 PCIe x16 slots, which run in a x8/x8 configuration when both slots are occupied. Now, the Aero G is a lot more affordable than the ProArt Creator because it doesn't feature 10 gigabit LAN. In fact, it doesn't even get 5 gigabit LAN, which is very disappointing in my opinion. Just dual 2.5 gigabit LAN is on offer here. The rear I/O is also very underwhelming with just 9 USB ports in total and just a single Thunderbolt 4 port, which is the only Type-C connector. So while much cheaper than the Asus model, the I/O is still disappointing when compared to much cheaper models like MSI's Tomahawk. Also, as a side note, Gigabyte will have a much higher end creator-focused Z890 motherboard called the Aero D, which includes better USB support, dual Thunderbolt 5 connectors, and crucially, not one but two 10 gigabits per second LAN connectors. But sadly, this model isn't ready yet, so we can't test it. Now, getting us to $400 is the Z890 Aorus Pro Ice, another white silver model, and again using a 16 80-amp power stage configuration for the V-core VRM. So the same VRM as the Elite X, just $70 more expensive. So what are you getting here? The wired networking has been upgraded from 2.5 to 5 gigabit, and the Wi-Fi 7 support now comes from an Intel chip rather than MediaTek. The M.2 and PCIe slot configuration remains the same, with the only other noteworthy upgrade seen on the I/O panel, where you'll find an additional Thunderbolt 4 port. That's it. So to recap, you're getting faster wired networking, possibly better quality Wi-Fi, and an extra Thunderbolt 4 port, all for an additional $70. It's hard to know if that's worth it or not. Now, for a big jump up in price, we have the Z890 Aorus Master at $560, which is another unique price point that positions this board between MSI's Carbon and MSI's Ace. The Master packs 18 110-amp power stages for the V-core, so again, nice and overkill there for the VRM, and of course, you're also getting some truly massive heatsinks. There's 5 M.2 slots, 2 of which are 5.0 compliant, and 3 PCIe slots. Around at the I/O panel, there's 14 USB ports in total, 2 of which are Thunderbolt 4 ports. There's 4 10 gigabits per second ports and 4 5 gigabits per second ports, along with 2 USB 2.0 ports. This configuration isn't as good as the cheaper MSI Carbon, but it's still certainly acceptable. Where the Master is most impressive and really matches the more expensive MSI Ace model is with its wired networking, including 10 gigabit LAN. So overall, the price and specifications of the Master see it positioned quite well. Things do get out of hand though with the Z890 AI Top, a $1,000 motherboard. This model includes 16 80-amp power stages for the V-core, which is quite reasonable. It's not extreme overkill, it's certainly sufficient, more than sufficient probably, but they haven't gone wild with the VRM. There's also 3 PCIe x16 slots, 4 M.2 slots, dual 10 gigabit LAN, dual Thunderbolt 5, and the thing's just massive, measuring 30.5 centimeters by 28.5 centimeters, making it an extended ATX motherboard, and a rather big one at that. Gigabyte has made use of all of this space by including truly massive heatsinks on basically everything. The I/O isn't nearly as stacked though as you might expect, with just 10 USB ports in total and 2 audio jacks. 2 of the USB ports are limited to 5 gigabits per second, but of course there are 2 Thunderbolt 5 ports offering 80 gigabits per second transfer speeds for Thunderbolt 5 devices and 40 gigabits per second transfer speeds for USB 4 devices. And then there's the 2 10 gigabit LAN connectors. The AI Top is certainly a unique motherboard, and while insanely expensive, if you want dual 10 gigabit LAN and Thunderbolt 5, it's one of the few boards offering these features, so perhaps the price isn't that insane. Now, if the AI Top's what you're interested in, but the workstation look just isn't for you, might I introduce you to the Z890 Aorus Master AI Top for $1,300. This model packs 20 110-amp power stages for the V-core VRM, but alarmingly drops the Thunderbolt 5 support for Thunderbolt 4, effectively halving the available bandwidth. Thankfully, the dual 10GB LAN functionality remains, and the PCIe configuration is very similar, and there's still 4 M.2 slots, just one of which is 5.0 compliant. Around at the I/O, you're getting 2 more USB ports, and now the slowest port is 10 gigabits per second, but of course Thunderbolt 5 has been swapped out for Thunderbolt 4. I'm not really sure why this board costs an additional $300, so I feel the cheaper, more simplistic looking AI top is the way to go. But wait, there's more. A lot more money to be spent, as we have the $1,900 Z890 Aorus Xtreme AI top. Insane, I know. This is the I want all the things model, and all the things you shall have. There's 22 110 amp power stages for the V-Core, dual Thunderbolt 5 on the I/O, plus a single Thunderbolt 4 header on board. Dual 10 gigabit LAN, Wi-Fi 7, dual PCIe 5.0x16 slots for multi-GPUs, insane onboard audio, and heat sinks for days. And boy oh boy are there a lot of heat sinks here. Your memory even gets its own active cooling, with RGB effects of course. The I/O is stacked with high-speed USB. The board is absolutely insane. Then finally, getting back down to earth, we have the last Gigabyte model, their mini ITX offering, called the Z890i Aorus Ultra, and it costs $350, so $20 less than the excellent MSI Z890i Edge Ti Wi-Fi. Gigabyte has the weakest power delivery, though 8 105 amp power stages for the V-Core should still be sufficient for even the Core Ultra 9 285K. Unfortunately though, like Asus, Gigabyte has only managed to squeeze in 2 M.2 slots, whereas MSI found a way to cram in 4. Gigabyte has also only included 2.5 gigabit LAN, whereas MSI provided 5 gigabit LAN, though both boards do feature Wi-Fi 7 support. The rear I/O was also quite disappointing, just 6 USB ports in total, which includes a single Thunderbolt 4 port, whereas MSI included 10 ports with 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports. So while I feel the Z890i Aorus Ultra is better value than the MSI Mini ITX board, for just $20 less than what MSI is offering, I feel like MSI does have the better value product here. As is often the case, Asrock's managed to outbid MSI, Gigabyte and Asus for the most affordable motherboard, as their Z890 Pro Z890 comes in at just $190, which is $20 less than Gigabyte's Z890 UD Wi-Fi 6E. And Asrock's achieved this by removing the wireless networking altogether, but you are still getting 2.5 gigabit LAN. They've also included a rather solid 16 60 amp power stage V-Core VRM. There's 3 PCIe slots, 4 M.2 slots, and 4 SATA ports. Then around at the I/O panel, there's a very basic configuration which I guess you'd expect to see given the price. It includes a Thunderbolt 4 port, which is essentially good for 40 gigabits per second using either USB 4 or Thunderbolt 4 devices. There's a single 20 gigabits per second port, a single 10 gigabits per second port, and 2 5 gigabits per second ports, along with 4 USB 2.0 ports. So really quite a good configuration given the price. So for those of you looking at a Z890 motherboard and don't need Wi-Fi, the Z890 Pro Z890-A, it's going to be hard to beat. Now there are a few versions of Asrock's Z890 Pro RS, and we've got all of them. There's the base model for $220, and then there's the Z890 Pro RS Wi-Fi for another $10, so $230, and that's available in either a black or white version. Now, the $220 non-Wi-Fi model includes a 16 60 amp power stage V-Core VRM, and then it includes the same audio and wired networking as the Pro Z890-A. It also has the same PCIe configuration, the same storage with 4 M.2s and 4 SATA ports, along with the same I/O, though the Pro RS comes with a pre-installed I/O shield. So the primary upgrades here include bigger VRM heatsinks for 3 of the 4 M.2 slots, basic RGB lighting, and a pre-installed I/O shield. So hard to say if that's worth the extra $30 or not. Then for an additional $10, you get the Wi-Fi 6E module with the Z890 Pro RS Wi-Fi, and there's the optional white version, which apparently goes for the same price. When compared to the Gigabyte Z890 UD Wi-Fi 6E, The Pro RS Wi-Fi features a more powerful VRM, an extra M.2 slot, and cooling for 3 of the 4 M.2s, whereas the Gigabyte board only provides cooling for a single slot. The Pro RS Wi-Fi also features 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports on the rear I/O, whereas the Gigabyte board includes just a single port. So I think for the extra $20, the Pro RS Wi-Fi makes sense, but of course that'll depend on the features that you use and require. Now things start to get more serious with the Z890 LiveMixer Wi-Fi at $240, because with this model you're getting 18 80-amp power stages for the V-Core, making this the most powerful VRM you can get at this price point. Asrock's also included 2.5 gigabit LAN, Wi-Fi 7, 3 PCIe slots and 4 M.2 slots, but where the LiveMixer really excels is over on the rear I/O, where you'll find a grand total of 14 USB ports, and none of which are USB 2.0s. So you're getting 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports, which Asrock says will throughput 40 gigabits per second using either USB 4 or Thunderbolt 4 devices. There's 2 10 gigabits per second ports and then 10 5 gigabits per second ports. This configuration blows all other $240 boards out of the water, making the LiveMixer the most compelling Z890 board in this price range. Now the most affordable micro ATX Z890 motherboard from Asrock is the Z890M Riptide Wi-Fi for $260, and this model uses 16 80-amp power stages to power the V-Core portion of the VRM, and cooling it are 2 large heatsinks. There's 2.5 gigabit LAN, Wi-Fi 6E, and just a single PCIe slot, so that's worth being aware of. There are also 3 M.2 slots and 4 SATA ports, though around at the rear I/O, you will find 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports, along with 2 10 gigabits per second ports, 4 5 gigabits per second ports, and 2 USB 2.0 ports, so a decent configuration there. Overall, it's a decent offering, and depending on what you're after, might be better than the Gigabyte Z890M Aorus Elite Wi-Fi 7. Next stop is the Z890 Lightning Wi-Fi for $270. This model features 18 80-amp power stages for the V-Core, and cooling them are some large heat sinks. There's also a heatsink for most of the M.2 slots, of which there are 4 in total, along with 4 SATA ports. This model also includes 2.5 gigabit LAN and Wi-Fi 7, along with 3 PCIe slots, and then the rear I/O is pretty basic. There's 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports, 2 10 gigabits per second ports, 4 5 gigabits per second ports, and then 2 USB 2.0 ports. Then for $290, we find the Z890 Steel Legend Wi-Fi. And this is a mostly silver/white design, though there are a number of black connectors. Anyway, Asrock has gone with an 18 80-amp power stage V-Core VRM, 2.5 gigabit LAN, Wi-Fi 7, 3 PCIe slots, 4 M.2s, and 4 SATA ports. Then around at the I/O panel, there's again 10 USB ports in total, and we have the same configuration as the Lightning Wi-Fi. In fact, for the most part, the Lightning and Steel Legend are the same motherboards. The Lightning is essentially the black version, and the Steel Legend the mostly white version, so hard to say if it's worth paying a $50 premium over the LiveMixer. Priced at $300 is the Riptide Wi-Fi, and this is a strong competitor to MSI's Tomahawk. The Riptide features an 18 80-amp power stage V-Core VRM, 2.5 gigabit LAN, Wi-Fi 7, 3 PCIe slots, and 5 M.2 slots. Then around at the I/O panel, you'll find 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports, 2 10 gigabits per second ports, 4 5 gigabits per second ports, and then 2 USB 2.0 ports. So this is a similar spec board to that of the MSI Tomahawk. Then at $350, we have the Z890 Nova Wi-Fi, and this model gets the full heatsink coverage treatment for all M.2s, and of course a big old VRM packing 20 110 amp power stages for the V-Core. You're also getting 2 wired LAN connections, one 2.5 gigabit and the other 5 gigabit, along with Wi-Fi 7. There's 2 PCIe slots and an incredible 6 M.2 slots, all of which feature cooling. Then around at the rear I/O, you'll find 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports, 4 10 gigabits per second ports, 4 5 gigabits per second ports, and 2 USB 2.0 ports. Now, jumping up to $400, we have the Z890 Taichi Lite, a no-frills high-end offering packing a 20 110 amp power stage V-Core VRM, dual wired LAN with 2.5 and 5 gigabit connections, Wi-Fi 7, 2 PCIe slots, and 6 M.2 slots. Then around at the I/O panel, there's 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports, 4 10 gigabits per second USB ports, 4 5 gigabits per second ports, and 2 USB 2.0 ports. so the same configuration as the Nova. In fact, the Taichi Lite and Nova are essentially the same board. The Taichi Lite just appears to be a worse version, so I'm not quite sure about the pricing here. The rear I/O configuration is also identical on both boards, but whereas the Nova features a single large tool-free heatsink over the M.2s, the Taichi Lite heatsink is smaller, covering just 3 of the M.2 slots, which leaves 2 of them naked. And the heatsink doesn't feature a tool-free design. The Nova also features an easy release mechanism for the primary PCIe slot, whereas the Taichi Lite uses the traditional and more difficult to reach release mechanism. So I really can't tell you why the Taichi Lite costs $50 more than the Nova. But it gets even more confusing because the standard Z890 Taichi costs another $100 at $500, and in terms of specifications, it's the same board as the Taichi Lite, just with a few extra RGB effects and tool-free design elements. Seriously though, the Taichi and Nova are basically the same product, the Taichi just costs a little over 40% more. Like Asus and MSI, Asrock also has their own overclocking focus motherboard called the Taichi OCF, and it costs $600, which is at least $100 cheaper than competing boards. Asrock's included 22 110 amp power stages for the V-Core, so a small upgrade over the Taichi, and of course this is a dual DIMM board, which helps a lot with memory overclocking. The I/O is fairly basic given this is an OC focused product, and along with the 8 USB ports there are 2 PS2 ports. Then there's the insane Z890 Taichi Aqua for $1,000, and this is a very cool looking motherboard with some very unique features. Firstly, as the name suggests, the board supports water cooling with water blocks for both the VRM and primary M.2 slot using a detachable heatsink design. Powering the V-Core VRM are 28 110 amp power stages, so again, like all other high-end Z890 motherboards, power delivery has been taken to the extreme and beyond. Asrock's also thrown in 10 gigabit LAN, along with 5 gigabit LAN, Wi-Fi 7, 2 PCIe x16 slots, and 6 M.2 slots. Then, one of the most unique aspects of the Taichi Aqua is the rear I/O, where you won't find a single Type-A USB port. Rather, there are 8 USB Type-C ports, 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports, along with 4 10 gigabits per second ports and 4 5 gigabits per second ports. And I have to say, it's a shame they couldn't make 10 gigabits per second the minimum spec here. It's also worth noting that Asrock includes a USB 2.0 bracket for connecting basic USB devices, such as your keyboard and mouse. Finally, from Asrock, we have the Z890 Nova Wi-Fi for $300, which is $70 less than MSI's Z890 Edge TI Wi-Fi. Asrock's managed to include a more powerful VRM, packing a dozen 110 amp power stages for the V-Core, which is 2 more than that of the MSI model. You're also getting 5 gigabit LAN and Wi-Fi 7, and thankfully Asrock were able to include 3 M.2 slots, so 1 less than MSI, but 1 more than Gigabyte and Asus. The rear I/O isn't quite as stacked as the MSI model, but for $70 less, I think what we're getting here is pretty great in terms of value. There's dual Thunderbolt 4 ports and 6 10 gigabits per second USB ports. So while spec-wise the Z890 Nova Wi-Fi isn't quite as good as MSI's Z890 Edge TI Wi-Fi, in terms of value, I think it's just as good. Then randomly, I've ended up with a single colourful motherboard, the iGame Z890 Flow V20, which is a white/silver motherboard with the most wavy heatsink you've probably ever seen on a motherboard. I guess you could say they flow. Anyway, I have no idea how much it costs, but I can tell you it uses 20 90 amp power stages for the V-Core. There are also 2 PCIe x16 slots with the second slot wide for x4 bandwidth, Wi-Fi 7, 2.5 gigabit LAN, and 5 M.2 slots, but just the primary slot is 5.0 compliant, and then around at the I/O we find 4 USB 2.0 ports, 4 10 gigabits per second USB ports, and 4 USB 4 Type-C 40 gigabits per second ports. So no Thunderbolt on this board, but you are getting USB 4. I've also acquired a single Maxsun motherboard, the iCraft Z890 Arctic, which is a mostly white-silver board, though there are some random black highlights. So I'm not really sure what direction we're taking here. Anyway, once again, I have no pricing info for this model, but it is an interesting looking board. The V-Core is powered by 16 50 amp power stages, which is a sensible configuration for a Z890 motherboard. Now, the interesting aspect of this board is that it includes 4 PCIe x 16 slots which support lane splitting, so you can run in a x8x8 or a x8x4x4 configuration. There's also 4 M.2 slots, Wi-Fi 7, 5 gigabit LAN, and Maxsun's gone with USB 4 support over Thunderbolt. So around on the rear I/O, you're getting an impressive 9 USB 10 gigabits per second ports and 2 USB 4 40 gigabits per second ports. Okay, so time for some testing, and given the fact that I had 50 motherboards to test for this single video, it was going to take some time, a lot of time. Therefore, I decided to create 2 test systems to halve the amount of time it would take to prepare all of the results for this video. Therefore, Thermaltake came to the rescue and supplied me with the necessary parts to make 2 identical test systems, so a big thank you to them for that. For testing, I'm using the Thermaltake CTE E550TG mid-tower case, Tough Power IRGB plus 1650 watt titanium power supply, TH420V2 ARGB sync all-in-one liquid cooler, and a 32GB kit of Tough RAM XG RGB D5 memory. Now be aware that both test systems were cross-referenced to ensure they were giving us the same data, and we did the same with the pair of retail 285K CPUs that we used for this testing. Then for recording temperatures, I'm using a digital thermometer with K-type thermocouples, and I'll be reporting the peak PCB temperature. Also, I'm not reporting delta T over ambient, instead I maintain a room temperature of 21 degrees, and to ensure a consistent ambient temperature, a thermocouple is positioned next to each test system. As for the stress test, I'm using the Intel Core Ultra 9 285K and for load Cinebench 2024, which was looped for an hour, at which point I'm reporting the maximum PCB temperature, again recorded using K-type thermocouples. Now, the main goal of this testing is to see if any boards throttle the Core Ultra 9's frequency, or run excessively hot, so over 100 degrees. Thankfully, all Z890 motherboards tested ran well within safe limits, which isn't surprising given all boards featured rather beefy VRMs, most well within overkill territory. I should also note that it doesn't really matter if one board runs at say 52 degrees and another at 70 degrees. Both are well within safe limits and there should be no noticeable difference for the user. Anyway, feel free to pause to take a closer look at this data, but the main takeaway here being that all boards performed well and there's no VRM thermal concerns while running the 285K. Here's a look at the average operating frequency for the P cores measured during the 1 hour long stress test, and the good news is all boards again performed well within a tight 3% frequency tolerance between the lowest and highest sustained clock speeds. So this means performance shouldn't deviate all that much, and we'll look at that in a second. Before that though, here's a look at power consumption across the EPS12V Rails, and please note the Asus models, coloured red, don't receive all of their power to the CPU via the EPS12V Rails. Instead, a few power stages are fed via the 24-pin ATX power cable, so that's why the EPS12V reading is lower for those boards. The vast majority of boards saw the 285K consume between 239 and 262 watts, so up to a 23 watt discrepancy there, or as much as a 10% fluctuation. That said, the Gigabyte Eagle averaged 268 watts, and the MSI Z890i Edge Ti pushed consumption to 289 watts, which would explain the higher than expected VRM temperature. I'm not exactly sure why this was the case for the MSI board. I did use the latest BIOS available at the time of testing, which was 7E33V 1A11. Now this isn't really important or even relevant data, but I collected it for all of the boards, so I might as well share it with you, just in case someone's interested. The peak operating temperature of the chipset after the hour-long stress test, and be aware this data hasn't been collected using K-type thermocouples, rather I'm reading the information out of hardware info, so I can't be sure of its accuracy. Now, once the 1 hour long stress test was completed and all relevant data had been logged, I instantly ran a 10-minute loop test 3 times and recorded the average result. So this data is based on motherboard performance when running the VRM at its peak temperature. From the lowest to the highest score, there's a 6% performance discrepancy, and if we ignore the Gigabyte UD, which was a small outlier, that margin comes down to just 5%, so a very tight grouping of results. Boot time performance is something some of you care about, and once the initial memory training is done, all Z890 motherboards boot very quickly. This data is based on a 3-run average, and this typically saw boards take anywhere from 18 to 21 seconds, and this is the time it takes to hit the Windows desktop from the time you power on the system. Memory validation took a very long time to test all 50 boards, and I'm only conducting a 1 hour long stress test, so it is quite limited in that sense. All boards passed the Gear 2 validation at 8200 and 8400 speeds, but jumping up to 8800 was challenging, and only 15 boards passed the hour-long stress test. 19 boards failed to post entirely, with the rest either crashing, loading into Windows, or failing during the stress test. And I should note that both the Core Ultra 9 25K processors used for testing were able to run multiple hours in Gear 2 mode with 8800 memory, providing the motherboard was capable. Okay, so that's a look at each board individually, along with all of the testing data, and that confirms, well, that all of the boards work to a satisfactory level, which is a nice peace of mind to have. We have seen some truly awful motherboards donning Z-series Intel chipsets in the past. So which models should you be on the lookout for? For budget builders interested in a Z890 motherboard, the Asrock Z890 Pro A is hard to go by, assuming that you don't need or want Wi-Fi support out of the box. At $190, it's the cheaper Z890 motherboard, and minus Wi-Fi, it's got all the basics covered. The Asrock Z890 Pro RS is also a nice board, though the Wi-Fi version is $10 more, but can be purchased in either a black or white model. Gigabyte Z890 UD Wi-Fi 6E is also compelling, as is the Z890 Eagle Wi-Fi 7, which is priced alongside MSI's Pro Z890-P Wi-Fi. The MSI model's a nice board, but at $240, it's not the most competitively priced, though I do like that you're getting 5 gigabit networking at this price point. Still, for me, the best value board has to be the Asrock Z890 Pro A, and the next best option is the Asrock Z890 Pro RS Wi-Fi, as it includes 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports on the rear I/O and a strong feature set overall. Those spending up around $300 US have a few nice options to pick from, and MSI's Z890 Tomahawk Wi-Fi is one of the best. The Gigabyte Z890 Aorus Elite Wi-Fi 7 is also decent, but I feel the Tomahawk is a better board overall. There's also the Asus Tough Gaming models, but both are inferior to the Tomahawk, with just a single Thunderbolt 4 port and 2.5 gigabit LAN, for example. So for me, the best mid-range $300-ish model is the MSI Z890 Tomahawk Wi-Fi. The best value micro ATX model is pretty easy for me, the Gigabyte Z890M Aorus Elite Wi-Fi 7, which is considerably better than the Asus Prime Z890M-Plus Wi-Fi for roughly the same money. The addition of tool-free M.2 heatsinks and PCIe easy release mechanisms is nice, and it's just a much more premium looking product. Then the best mini ITX motherboard in my opinion is the MSI Z890i Edge Ti Wi-Fi, but the Asrock Z890i Nova Wi-Fi is a close second. The Asus ROG Strix Z890-iGaming is certainly a nice high-end ITX board, but it costs way too much, and with just 2 M.2 slots it's very disappointing. Finally, we have the best Xtreme motherboard, and the MSI Z890 Godlike is disqualified as it's not ready and therefore we weren't able to test it. So MSI misses out there. Picking the winner here is difficult, as there are a number of great Xtreme options such as the Asrock Z890 Taichi Aqua, Asus ROG Maximus Z890 Xtreme, Gigabyte Z890 AI Top, or the Gigabyte Z890 Aorus Xtreme AI Top. Really, I can't pick. The Asrock Z890 Taichi Aqua is worth it for its liquid-cooled VRM and M.2 design, along with the exclusive USB Type-C rear I/O configuration. But the Gigabyte Z890 AI Top is impressive, and the Gigabyte Z890 Aorus Xtreme AI Top is just bonkers. The most extreme, over-the-top, and absurd Z890 motherboard is clearly the Z890 Aorus Xtreme AI Top, but my favourite option here is actually the more subtle-looking Z890 AI Top. For $1,000 US, it really has it all, minus the RGB lighting, which I can certainly do without. Anyway, there's loads of great Z890 motherboards. I just wish Intel's latest Core Ultra series of processors were a bit more impressive, or really a lot more impressive, because that would have helped justify the enormous amount of time and effort that went into making this content. But anyway, if you enjoyed this video, consider hitting the like button. Thanks to those of you who just watched it anyway to support the work we do. Even if you aren't interested in an Intel Z890 motherboard, we will have AMD B850 board roundups coming. I plan on looking at all of those. So hopefully that's a series that you guys will be more interested in general. But yeah, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to support our work directly, we have the join button or Patreon. Signing up to either one of those will give you access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, behind the scenes content, and some Q&A stuff. So check that out if you're interested, but if not, that's perfectly fine. And of course, I would like to thank you for watching this content. Very, very appreciated on this one. So thank you again. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.